Bria, could you put me onto the stage, please? Thank you. Great, lovely. Welcome to the second series of webinars from Emergency Services Times. I'm Catherine Levin and I'm the editor of Emergency Services Times. Our intention with this series is to continue the conversation from the Emergency Services Show. So many of our speakers over the last few webinars have come from the show, and some of those you'll perhaps hear about at this year's show in September. In our second series, we have looked at HS2 and we've also looked at local authority bankruptcy. But in this episode today, I'm delighted that we have been partnered with Crown Commercial Service to look at social value and procurement. In this webinar, we will be taking a multi-agency look, as we do with all our webinars, because that's our USP. We are having a chat. There's no presentation, no slides. It's a valuable conversation, which hopefully will give you something to take back to your organisations and to learn from what's being spoken about today. We've got a Q&A function. You should be able to see that on the side of your screen. And please use that to ask us questions along the way, and we'll introduce the questions as when we can, and hopefully we'll get to many of those. We also are providing CPD accreditation. So by attending this webinar, you will receive that after the live recording. And then for those of you watching catch up, you'll see that later in the month. Our plan is to run for about 50 minutes in total. So let's get started. Other attendees will come onto the stage now. So there's Charlene, and we're expecting Mick as well. There he is, fantastic. Unfortunately, Helen, there's some feedback a little bit there. So unfortunately, Helen Linklater from the Met is unable to join us with technical difficulties, so I apologise for that. But I'm delighted to be joined by with Charlene and Mick. Charlene is Head of Policy Delivery at Crown Commercial Service, and Mick works for Cheshire Fire and Cheshire Police as Environmental and Sustainability Lead. Welcome to you both. So let's talk about social value. Charlene, I'd like you to sort of clear up some things for us. What on earth is social value? What's the elevator pitch? Why are we talking about this?
Okay, no pressure to clear things up then. So yeah, as many on the call, on the webinar will know, social value is the additional value in the delivery of a product or a service contract, where there is a wider community or public benefit that can be created. So this extends beyond the value of the contract and its deliverables in itself. It involves thinking beyond making decisions based purely on financial costs, and instead focusing on the wider benefits that can be delivered to customers or the wider community. So it can include things like apprenticeships, volunteering programs, environmental benefits like waste or emissions reduction, removal of single-use plastics, or things like responsible and inclusive employment practices, but that list goes on. Lots of the things we already ask of our suppliers in the public sector could fall under the broader umbrella of social value, but it shouldn't stop there. It's all about that additionality.
Brilliant. Okay, that was a fantastic elevator pitch. Thank you for that. It's my understanding that the legislation around social value is about 12 years old now. So why is the emergency services particularly interested in social value now? Is something changed? Has there been some kind of catalyst? Is business as usual? Where are we sitting right now?
Well, yeah. So the Public Services Social Value Act, as it's known, was passed into legislation in 2012. So yeah, we are 12 years down the line. That act requires public authorities intending to buy services to consider what they're buying, how what they're buying might improve the economic, social, environmental well-being of the relevant area, and how the procurement process itself can secure that improvement. When the Act was initially established, social value was mostly used by local authorities and into sort of the wider public sector arena. It was seen by a lot of Whitehall departments as something that's done by local government. It's quite locally tied. Lord Young did a review in 2015 that pretty much confirmed that that was the case, that it was seen as something other people do in Whitehall, and he recommended an extension of the Act to strengthen that and increase uptake. In 2018 then we had the collapse of Carillion. That prompted a lot of questioning around the social purpose of businesses and what businesses who are receiving public sector funding are doing for the benefit of the wider public. Off the back of that then, obviously we had the procurement policy note for central government, taking account of social value in the award of central government contracts. That was published in September 2020. That has seen more of a push across central government in particular around looking at including social value in agreements, it is mandatory for central government departments to include social value in their evaluation criteria, for example. So we're starting to see more and more talk within the public procurement space around social value off the back of that. Looking forward, we have the Procurement Act coming into force later in the year. That makes reference to the National Procurement Policy Statement that came out last year or the year before, I think. That emphasises the need for all public authorities to have regard for 3 listed social value outcomes. So creating new businesses, new jobs, new skills in the UK, improving supplier diversity, innovation and resilience, and tackling climate change and reducing waste. So yeah, the Act's over a decade old, but it's still very much hugely important in the delivery of public procurements, and it's going to continue to be that way in the future. So I think we're all about it.
Excellent. Okay, so lots to go with there. So Mick, does that sound very familiar? Because obviously you're sitting there in Cheshire Fire and Police, you straddle both. So does that, what Charlene's been talking about, is that very familiar? Is it kind of something you talk about all the time, or where does it kind of fit within actually in a frontline service?
It's exactly right what Charlene said. That I don't think when we collaborated, the 2 organisations back in 2017, although the police had a policy already, it was as late as 2021 that Cheshire Fire signed up their ethical sourcing and social value policies. So the team on the police side, which encompasses fire as well now, they have had this social value element to contracts and tenders a lot earlier than the fire side did. And I know we're concentrating on the fire thing today, but it is a conversation that's happening all of the time now. And when I was scribbling a few notes, you know, you can win and lose a contract now on social value. Anecdotal evidence of people just, you know, copying and pasting from the internet to fill that bit, and it covers about 10% of all of our tenders and contracts. So it is something we're looking at. I don't think we've got it right yet. We have been looking at all types of contracts because we don't record it. We don't really measure the performance of this, and I think it gets lost in the operational management of some of these contracts. So we are looking to record and get performance data out of big and small contracts, but it's easier with bigger contracts, as we'll talk about in a moment.
Okay, can I just pick up on a couple of things there? So you talked about 10%. Did you mean 10% of the value of the contract, or 10%?
Yeah, 10%
of when you award it? Do you kind of have 10%? Does that contributes to the final marking for that contract when you go through the procurement process?
No, it contributes to the evaluation. Yeah, 10% of the scoring mechanism. Right,
it's quite low, isn't it? Do you think it should be higher? If it's really that important, shouldn't it be more of the value of the overall, you know, decision about that?
With being environment sustainability, yes, I would agree with you. But we've always concentrated on finance, and I know we've changed a bit from that. So it's been quite difficult to push the performance metric up higher in terms of percentage against cost and the public purse, but that's happened, and hopefully we will push social value further as we see the results of it.
Right, and Charlene, that point that Mick made about people cutting and pasting into the bit about social value that they find on the internet, from your experience at Crown Commercial, how do you kind of avoid that happening in terms of suppliers kind of doing that just to get through it? I mean, how do you make it actually meaningful and something that people really believe in?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing, and obviously in Crown Commercial Service we use the central government model that was developed as part of the central government procurement policy note. There are model questions as part of that model that central government departments are able to use. They can tweak to sort of meet the specifics of the procurement that they're working on. And I think that's the key bit. Obviously, the model's been designed. Potential suppliers can look at that model, can look at what the potential questions are going to be, what the model award criteria might be. So they may well have prepared answers, or at least prepared the structure of an answer for a bid, because they can expect what they may see in that procurement process. the key is about making it real. When we are tweaking those questions as procurement professionals, making sure they're really getting to the detail of the deliverables that will be provided through that contract, making sure it's relevant to that contract. So setting out in your question, these are the things I want to achieve when we talk about social value objectives. My organization wants to achieve this X, Y, Z. Yeah. What can you, in delivering this contract for me, deliver to help me meet those objectives? And I call it being open, but specific at the same time. So specific about what you want to achieve, but open to hearing suppliers' proposals as to what they may be able to do to help you, and then the evaluations around the quality of how well what they're proposing will meet your objectives. It makes sense.
Right. It's interesting. I was just looking. There's a question that's just popped up already, which is quite early for us to look at questions, but I'll do it because it talks here. What is the process for connecting social value across police, fire, and other sectors? So, if you have social value as a criteria in the evaluation of contracts coming through, wanting to get the work that you've asked for, are they very isolated? So what you do in fire is completely different to what you do in police, completely different to what you do in ambulance. Is there a sense of the totality? Should they all be sort of more aligned, or is that just not possible because these procurements are single? Any thoughts?
Well, in my case, they're similar because the procurement commercial team act for both.
You're doing both, so you're actually doing that already effectively.
Yeah, and obviously we're slightly different from the ambulance service, but across fire and police, well, in Cheshire we do it from the same. I would think that other forces and fire services that are separate probably do it differently. There's obviously finance and procurement rules in place that not everybody follows in the same way, I find. But no, and I think you have to make it appropriate to the contractor. We try desperately to work with local contractors. So whether you're looking at a small contract from a small company or small SME, you've also got to consider what possibly they could deliver, and use their speciality to the to the good of what we're trying to do.
Okay. So, well, that leads us quite nicely to the case study that we want to talk about, which is Cheshire fire stations being refurbished. Now, Mick, you've overseen this in terms of the social value side of things. So the problem you're trying to solve is that your fire stations are becoming not fit for purpose. They need to be modernised or refurbished for whatever reason. You put that contract out there to companies. What do you say to companies to say, actually, you need to put social value into this contract to get it? What are the elements of that that would be in the contract, and what have you seen from the refurbishment in terms of suppliers responding to that and delivering something that's tangible that we can all kind of relate to here?
Well, you mentioned 2012. So it does help that when you're doing some large capital projects with large construction companies, they do sort of come to the table already with quite mature methods and processes, and in the terms of the contractor we're using on this project, Wait Smart Space, they do have now a department in place. So there are people working alongside the contract, which their only role is to deliver social value for the contract.
That sounds quite expensive. Do they build that cost in when they charge you for the service? Is that all built in?
Well, but they will win the project on costs. So yes, if they are adding it, then everybody's having to add it.
Right.
But and then I think it's important to look at what you've got as well. And has the case study been made available to?
No, but we could put it into the reading list for afterwards. So yes, we could certainly share it.
Yes, if you would. So we also look at some of the things that we're heavily embedded with the Prince's Trust. We have schemes around Cheshire that run Prince's Trust courses all throughout the year. So it was easy for them, as you'll see within the document, to link in with Prince's Trust and look at some of the courses and getting them involved in the construction. and this then led on to workplace assignments during the different actions that went on. It's included some of those.
Sorry, mate. Can I just clarify?
Yeah.
So Prince's Trust young people were actually involved in the refurbishment of the fire stations as part of the contract. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no. During their 12-week Prince's Trust course, they were heavily involved with waste. In some cases, shadowing project managers, and admin functions were brought out of not only that, but the government's Kickstart program, so that we could engage with as many young people within the project as they're obviously local to us as well. And so it improves their skill. And there's several people who are now joining the Waits apprenticeship scheme as we move on further with the next 2 or 3 years of this refurbishment program.
And they're coming from the Prince's Trust volunteer, the ones who went to the Prince's Trust course.
From the Prince's Trust, and also from the government's Kickstart scheme as well.
Right. Okay. So you were very specific there. So you talked about Prince's Trust, which I think has been in Cheshire for some time. That's not new to Cheshire.
Yeah.
And there's a question here which asks about organisations identifying areas they would like supply to target. So effectively, that's what you've done. You've kind of embedded the Prince's Trust into that procurement, kind of in order for that to work. Is that the right way to see it? Is that how you've done it, to be that specific?
I don't. We didn't embed Prince's. We didn't embed Prince's Trust into the tender, but of course, when you start to look at some of the elements of what can be delivered, obviously Prince's Trust was an easy win. There are certain things within this study, because I had conversations with them about biodiversity projects, about tree planting projects, about doing other elements of environment and sustainability. But they concentrated in this case study around the local supply chain. And we are quite keen to make sure that we work with local people and that the spend of the supply chain is within the local areas. So what was reported in the case study was that £1.4 million of the spend of this project was in Cheshire, and the 69% or £2.7 million was within Cheshire or within 30 minutes of Cheshire. And we have a very very good supply chain of products through Cheshire and through this contract as well. So it does work into a overall 74% of the whole supply chain within this project came from within the Cheshire or 30 miles of the Cheshire border, which helps. Local people are working on the projects. They're seeing the local tax spend on local amenities in their area, and contractors become much more engaged in the projects if it's local to them. Okay,
that's really interesting. Charlene, that kind of very hyper-local approach in terms of getting the contract, the social value elements to feed into this local supply chain and define it up front, is that unusual? Do you see that elsewhere?
I would say social value is primarily be seen as a local thing.
Right, so that's the norm then. I wasn't sure whether it was.
Mick talked about a construction project. The construction sector is very mature when it comes to social value because there is that tangibility in terms of there is a project happening in a specific location, and there is employment involved, and there are environmental elements you can build into things. I think when we think about services procurements, sometimes you've got digital cloud-based services. There's not a physical delivery of a thing in a place. It's very hard then to tie social value into those sometimes. So then it sort of it forces a bit of creative thinking sometimes then in terms of, what does social value look like when you're buying cloud-based services? From the central government perspective, there was Lord Agnew had put a quite push on central government departments before he left his position at the time. He wrote out to all the departments saying, there is a digital skills gap in the civil service. We are spending quite a lot of money together on cloud-based services with businesses who understand this stuff and these digital skills things. They have that skill set. Why are we not using our procurement power, our social value opportunity to try and address that issue in that market? So then it's thinking about those sort of skills transfer and how do we look at producing opportunities to transfer skills into a sector. Now, in this case, it was civil service. It could be in a particular area. It could be things like, actually, well, what can you do with not just digital skills, but financial skills or safety skills or anything like that? How can we ask the suppliers to look at it has to be relevant to what they're doing, but, are there skills that the supplier base has that can be used to benefit the wider community? That's where it gets a bit more creative. I think that the sort of the construction-based projects, they're very mature because they've been doing it for quite a long time, probably because it was the most logical fit for social value. But we're seeing lots and lots of conversations around what social value might mean in a services-based procurement where there's not a localized delivery.
Right, interesting. So Mick, you used the word mature as well when you talked about weights, and it's interesting that company has an entire department dealing with it. Presumably they have contracts with other parts of the blue lights and the public sector as well. So going forward in terms of that relationship, does it just stay within that kind of sphere? We talk about Prince's Trust and young people and the local environment. Does it go beyond that? Because you talked about biodiversity. I thought that was quite interesting in terms of how you hook it into that sustainability agenda. So is that contract also leading to improvements in your green goals as well?
We have had some conversations, but going back to the maturity question, as we got into the stage 2 project, for example, our equality, diversity and inclusion manager held a workshop with the Waits team that work on this project, and some of their senior management team as well. And we developed this time for some of the senior managers of Waits to actually get involved with speaking to young people and youth groups in the area. So this project is maturing all of the time with new things. But slightly off the point of this case study, we recently were talking with a new contract that we'd done, and there was a large piece on social value, and we went and sat with the contractor and said, what about all this social value stuff you put in the tender? And they said, oh, we do all of that. And we said, well, you don't do it with us, so how are you going to deliver that to us? And they were under the impression, and they're a reasonably sized company, they were under the impression that because they do these things, then that was their social value. And of course, we've now introduced, we want some of that stuff done in Cheshire. So we are now developing a couple of schemes within schools, one with a local charity and one with an older generational group session in the summer. That I hope that by the time we get to the second year of the contract, we'll have expanded a little bit. We have to make it manageable for the management and operation. And on top of that, so as part of the new biodiversity regulations, I'm coming up with an ideas forum for all of our different locations. And in some places we have grounds and in some places we don't. So that we can have a program working on our considerations that will slowly grow the biodiversity across the entire estate. So as with many contracts that go on a period, they can be developed and people can start thinking creatively. Because you're right, not every contract you sign up to, it's easy to put some sort of social value marker on it. But and again, it's such a wide area when you talk about environment, sustainability, social value. There are so many boxes to tick. So there are many creative ideas of how you interact with different companies and different contractors. But I think it gets the message and it gets the working practices of the future right if everybody is engaged with it.
Yes, interesting. So you're doing that in Cheshire, having those conversations about being creative. Charlene, you talked about creative as well. So my question is about how do you share that? So we have all of these police forces, all of these fire services, and the ambulance. If we embrace the NHS, which is huge. How do you share good practice? How do you make sure that what you've just talked about in Cheshire, the people down in perhaps Kent Fire Service know about that and think, oh, I could do that too? What's the kind of sharing mechanism here and the learning?
Well, as was coming up slightly later in this in the programme, I chair the Emergency Services Environment Sustainability Group, and one of the key things in our terms of reference is the sharing of best practice. Right. And because of the success of that group, it now includes people from the Home Office, people from the College of Policing, and other touch points in other departments. We have procurement and senior commercial managers from around the country. We now have face-to-face conferences, and as you're aware, we are going to use your event in September to do our conference this year, along with our national estates teams. So all we do is we share best practice, and because we're emergency services, and we cover all of these areas, including the Royal Lifeboat Institute and Transport Police, so all of the emergency services you can think of. And we get together once every 2 months, and we look at new things. We talk about net zero, we talk about biodiversity. We have many mixed skill sets across: pure sustainability managers, pure people from the environment background, with added skills from everything from lobbying to marketing, and commercial managers from the Home Office, because we have to engage with not only our senior managers but also government departments. And this group, fire and police and ambulance, are now fully signed up to what is considered the National Charter. The National Charter came from our group and was put together by one of our subgroups. And it follows how people, planet and the public purse should be viewed in line with the UN global goals as laid out in 2019. And slowly but surely, there was a question in the documents about what our challenges are. Well, there's a massive challenge in the sector for decarbonisation of fleets. And we've recently consulted, had workshops, and put together a paper that's going to the Home Office that talks about the lack of funding, not for just electric vehicles, but for the infrastructure requirements, the charging infrastructure requirements, before we even get to purchasing an electric vehicle. And unfortunately, it's a negative subject, but funding is the underlining key to nearly all of this across our particular sector. So if you have a few pennies, you have to spend it really, really successfully.
Absolutely. So you've majored there very much on with the social value model that underpins all of this. There's 5 elements, and climate change is one of those. And what you're doing is helping with that. In terms of other areas, Charlene, so other groups or things that people should be aware of who are dealing with other elements of the social value model, sharing learning, perhaps in the kind of construction space we talked about earlier. Are you aware of any other places that perhaps people could go and read about to see how learning is shared?
Funny, I believe CCS is actually running a few events. So within our customer experience directorate teams, they have quite close links with emergency services sectors. And I have been asked last week if I can go and talk to the procurement heads of West Midlands police forces, so all in one room at one time. So we facilitate those kind of conversations as well, where we can. Sort of get people in a room in the CM sector, understand what kind of happened. We also have things where we are working with markets. So there are some supplier forums that we work with, for example, in the construction sector or in various sectors, where we will say, right, let's get in a room and talk about what can happen. We're doing something with tech as well soon to understand where are the snags in terms of what we're seeing in the overall aim and intent of having social value becoming a thing, where are the framework provider behaviors not helping? Where are supplier behaviors not helping? Where are buyer behaviors not helping? Where can we tackle some of those behaviors to smooth the progress for everybody? So there's lots of conversations going on around that at supplier side and buyer side. And that is kind of, I think, key thing is that supplier engagement from both framework provider side of things, but also buyers and sort of public authorities who are buying, having that engagement with the market to understand what the art of the possible is when we talk about social value before we get to the procurement stage, to really inform what we can do and how best to approach it in that market for that particular thing we're buying, in the time that we're doing that procurement and the sort of timescales and values that are involved. It's very tailored, I think. So the market engagement is really key to that.
Right. Okay. So lots of learning going on, but perhaps not at a national level all the time, but lots of subgroups and individual areas. I wonder, before we go back to the topic of environment and sustainability, which I'd like us to do a little bit more on, but before we do that, I'd just like to address a couple of questions. We've had one which has been upvoted quite a lot about related to the Procurement Act, and I'm not going to pretend to understand all of this, so I'll probably just read it, and then you can tell me what you think. It says, with the Procurement Act coming shortly, will the additionality actually no longer be relevant with regards to social value evaluation? Instead, will it form part of the core contract deliverables under the public benefit element of the Act and the SV reference within the NPPS? Does that make any sense to you? Because I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah, so NPPS is the National Procurement Policy Statement that I mentioned earlier. So that's already been published in terms of setting out the sort of the key priorities that the government of the day sets the National Procurement Policy Statement and what they want public authorities to look at in particular, have regard to, is the wording, the three key themes that they have looked at, which is job skills, environment, and supply chain diversity and things like that. That is sort of the hook into that is the Procurement Act is going to ask buying authorities to have regard to the National Procurement Policy Statement when undergoing procurement. So I think it's aligning the Social Value Act requirements a little more closely to the central government model in terms of the themes and outcomes that are set in there. I still think social value will be additionality, because ultimately at the minute we're all expected to have due regard or consider how social value might be included in our procurements as it is. I think there is still going to be, there's always that thing of, oh, we're already doing this, like Mike said earlier, we're already doing all this stuff. Well, if you're not doing it for me, it's not social value, that's your corporate social responsibility. And that's great that you're doing that. Don't stop doing that. But social value is all about using the power of our procurement to drive additional benefits. And if it does become part of the sort of the public benefit considerations, fine, but it's given it that weighting that sort of says it's really important that you do additional stuff. It's not what you're already doing. It has to be additional to be driving additional benefits and value.
So Mick, in terms of your, I hope so too. I'm just going to ask a follow-up from Mick in terms of the Procurement Act just broadly. Does that bring any new challenges or concerns for you, or is it an opportunity? I'm not sure how it lands in the service.
Well, I'm hoping it's going to be an opportunity. Sometimes in the public sector, it's a little bit challenging. It's a bit long-winded, and we seem to rush off back to procurement at set dates rather than when we need to. But I think the wider thing is about driving value for money. And if the new procurement legislation, and hopefully I believe my team in Cheshire were at a briefing this morning, and I'm sure in the very near future they will have a session and brief us about how these things are moving forward. But you know, from the case study that you're going to make available to people watching, the overall value of this year 2 project was £3.6 million, and been able to measure £1.6 million worth of social value benefit out of that public spend. And there's lots of things that I think are missing out of this case study, because they've concentrated on the supply chain and also the dealing with our organisations and the youth and elements. 504 local people in employment, 4 opportunities for disadvantage, 465 people helped improve in local skills, £27,000 more opportunities for local SMEs and help for community and voluntary sector. And I think that's all important. And I think because we have to show value for our public purse spending, this is the perfect way of doing it. And if I could add 2 or 3 more pages to this case study about some of the things that we're looking at in the future with weights in biodiversity, and they've done a couple of biodiversity things for me. In biodiversity, working with schools, because there was a schools project going on at the same time as this, and looking at other works they've done which have benefited not so much us but the community. I mean, in one case they went and put up a fence because you know, it was an old lady's garden and it was blown over during the storm, so they just went and replaced the fence for her because they happened to be on site. And these little things, it's very difficult to measure, but yeah, it was just done.
Okay.
And I think that relationship and letting these things mature naturally should lead to really good results.
Yes, I think that's a very clear message from what we were both saying, is that what's necessarily on the original procurement document when people put it in is not necessarily what comes out at the other end when the contract has ended years later, but it changes and evolves. It's not static. Would that be a fair summary? Charlene, is that how you sort of perceive it?
Yeah, I mean, I think procurement people love to show numbers because it's the easy thing. What and they say, you know, what gets measured gets done. If you're able to put a number on something, then fantastic. Yeah. You're able to say it's happened. But with social value, so much of it is about the individual impacts, and it can be like on the old lady whose fence fell down. That's a massive impact for her. You can't put a number on that. Yeah, and I think absolutely. What I always think, you know, we have to be wary of falling into the trap of being really rigidly set on numbers and what can be measured easily and what fits into a nice pigeonhole. Because so much of, you know, talking about, you know, you could measure the number of Kickstart members who come in to work with weights. You can look at the number of young people from Prince's Trust that have come in and got involved and done that. But actually, when you talk about who are now going on to do the apprenticeships, that's a different metric that might get ignored. Or actually, in the long term, does that apprenticeship create upward social mobility for the individuals? And that's long-term massive impact, not easy to measure now. So it can evolve over time, and I don't think we should be afraid of having conversations with our suppliers where, yes, we have a KPI in the contract because that's what they put in, but actually, if those things mature and evolve over time, I think we should have grown-up conversations about them.
Yeah. I wonder, actually, Mick, in terms of the authorities, so the Fire Authority and the PCC, do they have any sense of these kind of values, these intangibles that are coming through the procurement of goods and services into their organisations, and then how it's having that long-term effect on their communities? Do you think any discussions take place at that kind of political, strategic level?
No.
Do you think they should? It sounds to me like some of the politicians.
Well, it should, and I have colleagues around the country who their PCC or their chief fire officer or their chief constable shout this from the rooftops. Yeah. But it's a bit of a challenge bringing some of those people in those positions and the political people in those PCC positions into this. It becomes very favourable around about now because it's election time.
Because there's a PCC elections in May.
Yeah, so yes, what have we done in this space? And obviously there's a lot of focuses in police and fire and all of the time, but there is a more national conversation happening. Endorsement by the senior bodies of the National Charter, the new Fire National Strategy on Environment and Sustainability, the work that Blue Light Commercial are doing as the representative of the MPCC in environment and sustainability is moving things forward in that area. Far too slow. But yeah, it's. But I go back to a simple point, and again, it comes down to funding because it's a resource issue. There are certain government departments that on the side of their procurement department have a social value person. And my procurement and contract managers, and even my operational managers who have and manage contracts on a day-to-day basis, they don't have the time or resource to also be looking at recording the elements of the social value bit. And I'm hoping we've raised it at a meeting recently, and I'm hoping that we're going to slowly bring that further in, so people are, mainly operational managers, are having to look at what the social value is delivered in their new contract and what they're then getting out. Not in a big way, but in a small way to start. And so it starts to develop, and we get the benefits, which is what Charlene is talking about.
Yeah, to capturing it and making it actually quite tangible, all those things that you talked about. We only have a few minutes left, so what I'd quite like to do is just take this question which has been upvoted around, it kind of touches on something we said earlier, but I think it's slightly different. It says, how does the procurement team evaluate the social value response in a service from a SME, so a small company versus a large organisation? Does it make any difference in terms of how you're doing that evaluation for the size of the company? Charlene? It
can. I think, and this comes down to the sort of the qualitative versus quantitative evaluation methodology debate. Again, in procurement circles, we like to have numbers to put on things because it's very objective. But the central government social value model, when it was being designed, we had a lot of conversations around what's the appropriate way to evaluate a social value proposal. The central government model for social value recommends qualitative evaluation. We do not look at numbers. It's about assessing the quality of a supplier's proposal and how that meets your objectives for social value, not about how much the supplier will give you or how much social value in pounds or return on social investment that the supplier is proposing. Because we do have, especially on like national framework agreements, we have got suppliers who are multinationals and we have suppliers who are micro businesses, and they're all competing in the same field for some of these agreements, and we do not want a situation where we're comparing apples and pears. And we recognize as well that a lot of the small businesses have got massive skill sets that we can use if we don't have a blinkered approach to our procurement and social value. Open up those conversations to innovation. So like I said earlier, set out what your objective is if you have a carbon reduction target, or if you want to reduce plastics, single-use plastics in your entire supply chain by X amount by a certain date. By all means, explain what those social value objectives are in your procurement documentation to all suppliers, but then invite their proposals as to what they can do to help you meet those in delivering the contract. So that gives them the opportunity to innovate. It gives them the opportunity to propose something that works with their skill set, their size, their capability, their capacity, with the known details of the contract. So what's the value? How long is this contract going to be? Is it a really short one that we can do something quick? Or is it a long-term contract where we have the opportunity to come up with a real strategy and work in partnership with you? It gives the suppliers a bit of control back, which levels the playing field for SMEs and large businesses who may have a social value team that can come up with these things. But if you're not overly blinkered in how you ask the questions and sort of evaluate on that quality approach, that levels the playing field for everybody.
Okay, and then there's a second and probably the last question we'll take, which is around subcontracting. So obviously you may do your contract with a prime contractor who may have many subcontractors depending on the size of it. How do you get the social value into the subcontractors? How does that work? Mick, did you have that with the weights work with the refurbishment of the fire stations? Is this something you can speak to?
Well, it's all part of the main tender, but of course if you're specifying that, local subcontractors contractors have to be predominantly from Cheshire or within 30 miles of the Cheshire border. Obviously, if you have to have a particular specialist, then and that's why you couldn't say everybody. And by then engaging with the workforces that are coming onto stations with inclusion managers and then involving them with the Prince's Trust and all of that, you are passing the social value down the line, because people wait and look for their subcontractors to deliver what they have got to do. They've also got to be looking for their subcontractors to be delivering something for them. So I would hope, I can't confirm, but I would hope that it's slowly being pushed down the line. And yes, I think we're quite grown up about how we look at the social value it's not good to write nothing, but it's not also good to write something you can't deliver.
Okay, all right, good advice. In fact, so that leads me on nicely, a little bit of feedback there, leads me on nicely really to our closing question, which is for both of you to consider what is the piece of advice you'd like our listeners to take back to their organisations when they're thinking about social value. What is the one thing you want them to think about or talk about, given what we've talked about today? What piece of advice would you give them? Should we start with you, Mick?
Well, I've mentioned it a couple of times, and you've got to record it, and you've got to review it, and you've got to monitor it. And if you have the resource and you have the time, you have to actively go and do something about it. And then when you do report it, you have to shout it from the rooftops.
Brilliant.
I'll say that because I didn't see this case study until you sent it to me.
You weren't supposed to say that.
Yeah, and I've taken that up with several people, because what we did is we insisted that Waits and our team work on this social value, and then it just goes into the project folder. And I said, if I'd have seen this and you'd have sent this to me as a sustainability manager, I'd have been shouting this from the roof of the fire station that we had.
That they've refurbished. Brilliant.
Tell the local community of this is how we've spent your local your taxes on your local facilities, and so I'll be doing that. I'll be doing that in the near future.
Brilliant. It's a good story for your local newspaper as well, I think. So, Charlene, exactly. So what's your one? What is your parting piece of advice for our watchers today from our webinar?
I would say be open-minded. So be open-minded in conversations with suppliers and pre-market engagement about what's possible, what's relevant to what we're looking at buying here, what are you already doing that we can build on, what can we do, but also be open to borrowing great examples from others and learning from others. So sharing that information across the different emergency services groups, borrowing what works well. The central government model, it's not mandatory for anyone on this call probably, except for me. But there's some good stuff in there. Have a look at it, go through it, see what you can adopt and what you can borrow, and just share as much information as possible with as many people as possible about these things. And the case studies at the end, always good to share those too.
Fantastic. Well, great advice. So we take from that you have to borrow and shout from the rooftop. So thank you so much to both of you for joining us for the webinar today, which draws us to an end. Some great questions there. It's really nice to have a lot more interaction there. So thank you for that. Just leaves me to close the webinar. So thank you very much for speaking for us today, and for Crown Commercial Service for being our partner today. So thank you, Charlene, for joining us from Crown Commercial. The webinar will be available to watch on catch up via our website. You will see there will be notes there as well. So the case study that Mick has referred to many times, we will put a link into this so that you can see that when this webinar finishes. We will have the CPD accreditation. So if you wish to take advantage of that, you'll get that by email, and on catch up, you'll receive it towards the end of the month. It's the final webinar in our second series, but we'll be back in April on the 18th. We'll be talking about data sharing, and we'll be talking to Humberside Fire and the Metropolitan Police about data. And we'll also be talking on the 25th of April to Crime Stoppers and the National Guardian's Office about whistleblowing culture, which is very timely. So hopefully you'll join us again for those. In the meantime, please look at our website, emergencyservicestimes.com, and sign up for our weekly digest so you can hear all about what's happened in the week on a Friday morning. Which leaves me just to say thank you very much for watching.